My name is Helen Avery. I am 65 years old, a retired nurse who once believed that peace was something you earned after a lifetime of caring for others. I live in a small apartment near Charleston now, surrounded by soft light, old books, and the quiet hum of the sea. For years, I thought my life had already told its final story. But then one morning, the phone rang, and everything I believed about love, trust, and family changed in the space of a single breath. Before I begin, if you believe that dignity still matters, if you know what it feels like to be silent when your heart is breaking, I invite you to stay. Subscribe and listen closely, because this is not just my story. It's a reminder that silence can be stronger than betrayal. It was early, the kind of quiet morning where the world feels gentle enough to touch. I was boiling water for tea, watching the kettle tremble and whistle, when the phone began to vibrate on the counter. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something about the way it kept ringing, steady, insistent, made me pick it up. "Mrs. Avery?" A man's voice asked, too brisk, too professional. "This is Carter from Palmetto Realty. Congratulations on your sale. The papers went through this morning." At first, I didn't understand. Sale? Papers? I pressed the phone closer to my ear. "I think you've got the wrong number," I said. "I haven't sold anything." He hesitated. I could hear him flipping through pages. "Riverbend Drive, right? The property closed at $680,000. Your son handled the transfer." The whistle of the kettle filled the silence. I turned it off, but the ringing inside my head didn't stop. "My son," I repeated, the words tasting strange in my mouth. "You're saying my son sold my house?" "Yes, ma'am. Evan Avery. Everything looks good on our end." I wanted to say that there must be a mistake, that I had never signed a thing. But instead, I looked out the window at the sunlight crawling over the rooftops and said softly, "Thank you for letting me know." Then I hung up. I stood there for a while, the steam from the kettle fogging the glass, my reflection a blur between who I was and who I had just become. Somewhere inside the apartment, a clock ticked too loudly. The quiet I once loved now pressed down like weight. On the shelf above the sink sat an old photograph of my late husband, David, in his Navy uniform, smiling like the world was still kind. Next to it, a small wooden box, the one that held a handful of his ashes, his handwriting carved into the lid. "Home belongs to you." I touched the words with my fingertips. My hands have always told my story better than my voice ever could, calloused from years of work, steady even when my heart wasn't. Those hands raised a son, held dying strangers, stitched wounds that weren't mine. And now, those same hands trembled over the idea that everything David and I built could vanish without a single word from our own child. For a moment, I imagined walking to the house myself, knocking on the door, demanding an explanation. But even in my shock, a quieter instinct whispered, "Wait. There are truths that only reveal themselves in silence." I sat down at the small kitchen table, the phone still in my hand, and scrolled through old messages. Evan's last text had been 2 weeks ago. "Love you, Mom. Don't worry about anything." I had smiled when I read it then. Now it felt like a line written by a stranger. I dialed his number. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. "Hey, it's Evan. Leave a message." I didn't. I just listened to his voice fade and pressed the phone to my chest, as if that could hold back the wave building inside me. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked, and the morning moved on as if nothing had happened. I poured the tea anyway. The cup rattled slightly against the saucer. I sipped it cold. When you spend decades giving care to others, you start to believe that love will be returned in the same language. But sometimes, love turns into something quieter, something harder. It becomes the sound of a phone hanging up before you can ask why. I walked to my desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a manila envelope marked Riverbend. Inside was the deed, my name, still printed clearly across the top. I traced each letter slowly. I remembered the day David and I signed it together, how he laughed and said, "Someday, if he ever forgets who you are, remind him who raised him." I whispered those words now, as if saying them could reach him across whatever distance pride had built between us. The morning light shifted, catching the edge of the photo frame. David's face glowed briefly, then faded as a cloud passed. The room felt smaller. I closed the envelope carefully and placed it beside the ashes. Maybe peace isn't the absence of noise. Maybe it's the decision to stay quiet when every part of you wants to scream. I cleaned the kitchen, rinsed the cup, folded the towel, and returned to my chair. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply sat there, letting the truth settle like dust in a room no one visits anymore. By noon, I had almost convinced myself it could still be a misunderstanding. But a single thought kept circling back, sharper each time. If my son had sold the house behind my back, then I needed to know how and why. I picked up the phone again, not to call Evan this time, but to dial another number, one I hadn't used since David's funeral. When she answered, her voice was as steady and calm as I remembered. "Helen," she said, "it's been a while." "Yes," I replied, my fingers tightening around the phone. "It has. Margaret, I think I might need your help." That was the moment the silence stopped being my comfort and became my weapon. That night, I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Somewhere out there, my son was celebrating something he didn't yet understand. I looked at David's photograph one more time and whispered, "You were right. He's forgotten who I am." The kettle on the stove began to hum again, soft and low. I let it sing, because sometimes the things we lose are only reminders of what we're about to find. Tomorrow, I would begin to remember who I was before I was anyone's mother. I didn't sleep much that night. The moonlight pressed through the thin curtains, pale and restless, like a question that wouldn't stop asking itself. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the house on Riverbend Drive. I saw its white porch, the climbing roses David planted, the marks on the doorframe where Evan's height had been penciled year after year. I could almost hear David's laughter drifting from the kitchen, the way it always did when he called me Nurse Avery, pretending to salute as if I were the one saving the world. That house wasn't just a structure. It was our history nailed into wood and brick. And now it was gone, or almost gone. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the wooden box David had left me. His handwriting on the lid was still as neat as the day he carved it. "Home belongs to you." Inside, beneath a folded American flag and a photograph of us on our wedding day, there was a sealed envelope I had never opened. I traced the edges with my thumb before tearing it open. The paper inside was yellowed but strong. David's handwriting leaned slightly to the right, the way it always did when he was thinking too fast. "Helen," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're standing in the house we built together. You'll want to give it away someday, or share it, because you always see goodness in people. But promise me this, never sign anything without reading the fine print. And if he ever forgets who you are, remind him who raised him." I folded the letter back carefully, as though my fingers could still feel his warmth in the ink. I thought about the night he wrote it, how he had called me into the living room and made me sit beside him on the floor. He had been sanding that same box, the smell of pine filling the room. "It's not for me," he had said, smiling through the fatigue that cancer had etched into his body. "It's for you, a place to keep what matters." That was 2 days before he died. I remember holding his hand in the hospital, my uniform still on because I couldn't bring myself to change. He had looked at me and whispered, "You have a way of making quiet feel like home." I didn't understand it then. I do now. After reading the letter, I went to the closet where I kept the old family safe. The combination had never changed. Inside were documents, insurance, birth certificates, a few photos, but the one that mattered was there, exactly as I'd left it. The deed. My name still printed in black ink, bold and unaltered. So how could anyone have sold it? I looked over the details again, every line familiar. David had always been meticulous. We never added Evan's name. We never transferred ownership. There was only one signature, mine. I set the papers on the table beside the letter, and for the first time since that phone call, a sense of calm began to return. If the house was legally mine, then whatever Evan had done wasn't just wrong. It was impossible without deceit. But instead of anger, I felt something heavier, quieter. Betrayal doesn't always come like thunder. Sometimes it seeps in like a slow leak, flooding everything you thought was safe. I poured myself another cup of coffee and stared at the tiny bubbles floating on the surface. My reflection trembled in them, small and uncertain. I remembered the first time I saw David across the hospital ward, back when I was 23, and he was still wearing his navy blues. He had come in with a fractured wrist from a training accident. He had smiled, even through the pain, and said, "You look like you fix things that don't want to be fixed." That's how our story began. Two people who believed that if you took care of something long enough, it would always come back to you whole. I thought that same rule applied to people. I closed the box and held it against my chest. The wood was cool, the edges smoothed by time. That's when I noticed something written on the underside of the lid, faint but legible. "Everything built in love can survive one storm." It made me smile, even as my throat tightened. Maybe this was the storm David had meant. I sat there until the light outside shifted from silver to gold, until the room began to smell of morning again. And in that quiet, I made a decision. If David had trusted me to guard our home, then I would honor that trust. I wouldn't confront Evan in anger. I would find out what really happened. And I would do it the way David taught me, with calm hands and a clear mind. The next day, I walked to the storage unit where I kept old family boxes. I wanted to find any record that might explain what Evan had done. There were photos of birthdays, a scrapbook from our trip to Savannah, even the faded blueprint of the Riverbend house. In the margin, in David's handwriting, was a small note. "Add second window. Helen loves the morning light." I traced that line, and something inside me steadied. The betrayal still hurt, but the memory of his care reminded me that goodness once lived in that house. Maybe it could live again, even if only as a memory. As I locked the unit, my phone buzzed. A new message from Evan. "Hey Mom, hope you're well. We've been busy with some paperwork. I'll call soon. Love you. Paperwork." The word pulsed on the screen like a quiet confession. I didn't reply. I simply stared at it until the screen went dark. When I got home, I placed David's box on the windowsill, where the light could touch it. I made another cup of tea and stood beside it, feeling his presence fill the room. The world outside was still. a kind of peace that comes before a reckoning. I looked at the envelope with the deed once more and whispered, "I kept your promise, David. Now I'll keep mine." For the first time in days, I didn't feel helpless. I felt ready. Because when someone sells your home without asking, they don't just steal your walls, they test what's left of your soul. And if David taught me anything, it's that I have more strength in me than anyone expects. The next morning, I would see Evan and Tara again, and I would start watching more closely than they ever imagined. It's strange how distance doesn't always begin with miles. Sometimes it begins with silence, the kind that stretches between words, between dinners that never happen, between messages that end with "love you" but feel like habit instead of truth. That silence had been growing between Evan and me long before the phone call. I just hadn't wanted to see it. After David's death, I thought keeping the house open to our son and his wife was a way to stay close. I told Evan they could live there until they were ready to buy their own place. He hugged me, said he'd take good care of it, said I'd always have a home there whenever I wanted to visit. I believed him. Belief is easy when it wears the face of your child. But lately, every visit had become shorter, every call colder. A few months ago, I texted Evan to ask if I could drop by with a pie for Tara's birthday. He replied hours later, "Maybe next week, Mom. Tara's got family in town." I never heard from them that week. That morning, sitting at my kitchen table with David's letter still fresh in my mind, I realized I couldn't remember the last time Evan had hugged me without looking at his phone. I decided to drive by the Riverbend house that afternoon, not to confront him, just to see it. Maybe to remind myself that it still stood, that it hadn't disappeared like trust does when you stop tending to it. The drive was short but heavy. The trees along the river bent low from the wind, their reflections shaking across the water. When I turned onto Riverbend Drive, I slowed down. The house looked the same from a distance: white fence, blue shutters, mailbox leaning slightly right. But up close, the details had changed. The rosebush David planted was gone, replaced by a row of gray stones. The curtains were drawn. Even the welcome mat was missing. I parked across the street and sat there, my hands resting on the steering wheel. I saw Tara through the window, pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. Her other hand rubbed her forehead the way she always did when anxious. A minute later, Evan appeared behind her, gesturing sharply. He looked thinner than I remembered, his jaw tight, his hair unkempt. They didn't see me, but their expressions told me enough. Tara was crying. Evan was talking too, fast, shaking his head. I watched his lips form the words, "I'll fix it," though I couldn't hear the rest. Then he stormed toward the back of the house, slamming the door. I should have driven away right then, but something rooted me to that spot. It wasn't curiosity. It was grief, the kind you feel when the people you love start living a life you don't recognize. A few minutes later, Tara stepped outside with her phone still in hand. She looked around nervously, then began typing. When she turned slightly, I saw the text reflected in the window. "We need more time. He's trying to get another loan." I felt my breath catch. Loan. That single word pressed against the glass like a warning. I started the car and drove off slowly. Halfway down the road, I stopped at a small cafe and sat inside by the window. My tea grew cold while I watched rain streak down the glass. The sound reminded me of hospital monitors, steady and relentless. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our old messages again. Evan sending pictures of the renovations. Tara thanking me for helping with the down payment. All smiles and gratitude. I wondered when those smiles had begun to cost so much. When I got home, the mail was waiting in a small pile on the doormat. Most of it was routine. bills, coupons, a magazine. But one envelope stood out. It was addressed to Helen Avery, accidentally delivered to me. The return address read, Mid-South Brokerage. I shouldn't have opened it, but my hands were shaking before my conscience could catch up. Inside was a notice of default, a margin call for a $180,000 investment loan. The document was dated 2 weeks earlier. For a long time, I just stared at it. The numbers blurred. The letter smelled faintly of printer ink and fear. It wasn't just greed. It was desperation. That realization didn't make the betrayal easier, but it changed its shape. Evan wasn't a villain in my story. He was a man drowning quietly, too proud to ask for help. And Tara, her silence suddenly made sense. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my drawer. That night, I tried calling him again. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I left no message, only listened to the small sound of emptiness at the end of the line. Later, as I sat by the window with a blanket around my shoulders, I thought about all the times I told my patients that healing takes patience, that wounds need time before they close. Maybe families were the same. Maybe this was our wound, the kind that bleeds slow and quiet until you finally notice you're lightheaded. Outside, the rain had stopped. The streetlight reflected off the puddles, making the world look like a painting smeared with gold. I thought of David again. He had always said, "You can't fix someone who hides their hurt." Evan was hiding something, and now I had seen enough to know it wasn't just shame. It was survival. Still, the ache in my chest deepened, because love, even when betrayed, doesn't turn off. It lingers like the echo of a song you used to hum together. I pressed my palm against the window and whispered, "Whatever you've done, I'll find out. But I'll do it my way." The next morning, I took David's letter, folded it once more, and tucked it into my purse. I looked around my apartment, small, quiet, safe, and realized it was no longer enough. The truth was waiting for me somewhere between what I saw and what I refused to see. As I stepped outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a pale shimmer on the wet pavement. I walked toward my car, the sound of my footsteps steady and certain. Somewhere ahead, I knew the next piece of the puzzle was waiting. The morning smelled like rain and cut grass. I baked a small chocolate cake, the same kind I used to make for Evan's birthdays when he was little, and set it gently in a white box. I thought maybe if I showed up unannounced with something sweet, we could talk. Maybe the warmth of something familiar would remind him of who we used to be. Mothers tell themselves stories like that. We mistake gestures for solutions. As I drove toward Riverbend Drive, the streets shimmered with the leftover rain. The sky was clear now, a soft blue stretched thin over the trees. For a moment, I let myself imagine the house as it had been. The curtains open, the porch light glowing, the sound of laughter spilling out from the kitchen. But when I turned the corner, I saw something that stopped me cold. 2 bright balloons were tied to the mailbox. A white sandwich board stood at the edge of the lawn, its letters black and proud. Open house. Today, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. I parked a few houses away, the cake box still resting on the passenger seat. A couple walked past me carrying a brochure. I followed them with my eyes as they walked up the driveway, shaking hands with a man in a navy blazer. Agent Carter. His smile was rehearsed, professional, the same voice I'd heard on the phone. I stepped out of the car, my heart steady but heavy. The smell of fresh paint hit me as I approached. It was the same smell David and I once celebrated, back when new paint meant new beginnings. Now it meant erasure. Carter turned and saw me before I spoke. His smile faltered. "Mrs. Avery?" he said, his voice too polite. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to see this either," I said softly. "Is this my house?" He hesitated, glancing toward the couple behind him. "Your son assured me he had your full authorization. The sale's almost final. Congratulations, by the way." "Congratulations," I repeated, tasting the word like something sour. He handed a brochure to another visitor. I looked around. The living room was bright with artificial light, candles lit on the mantel. But it wasn't the same. David's photo was gone from the wall. The old oak table we'd refinished together had been replaced by something sterile and white. The air smelled like lemon cleaner and new money. I moved slowly through the rooms, one hand on the wall. My fingers brushed the spots where pictures used to hang. Evan's graduation photo, David's medals, the frame that held our first family portrait. All gone. In their place were blank spaces, ghost outlines where a family used to live. When I reached the living room, I saw the mantelpiece, empty. The wooden box that had held David's ashes, gone. The space where it sat was wiped clean, as if it had never existed. I stood there for a long moment, the sound of voices fading behind me. Someone laughed from the kitchen. I turned toward the window and saw my reflection in the glass. I looked calm, too calm, the kind of calm that hides a storm. I walked outside, the cake still in my hands. The wind picked up, lifting the corner of the napkin tucked beneath the box. I took one step down the porch, then another. Someone called out behind me, "Ma'am, are you all right?" But I didn't answer. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I saw a man in a suit almost trip over the cake I'd set down. He apologized quickly and kept walking, his shoes leaving a brown smudge across the icing. I stared at it, the mark spreading like ink through water, and felt something inside me settle into a quiet I hadn't known before. That was the moment humiliation turned into resolve. I walked back to my car, opened the glove compartment, and took out a small notepad. I wrote down what I had seen. Agent Carter, Palmetto Realty, buyer, ask name. My handwriting was slow but steady. Years of nursing had trained my hands to stay firm even when my heart wasn't. When I got home, I set the notepad beside the deed and made tea. The kettle hissed, the same way it had that morning when everything started. I opened my laptop and typed in Palmetto Realty Charleston. The first listing that appeared had a familiar address, Riverbend Drive. I clicked it. There it was. Pictures of my home, my furniture, my walls. A line of text underneath read, "Modern upgrades throughout. Motivated seller. Move-in ready. Motivated seller." I sat back and let the words wash over me. My son had used my house to solve his debt. He hadn't just sold property, he'd sold history. I printed the listing, folded it neatly, and slid it into the same envelope as the deed. The edges of the paper trembled slightly in my hand. Later that evening, I received a text from Evan. "Hey, Mom. Sorry we missed you today. Been running around with the realtor. Big news soon. Love you." I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I opened the cupboard where I kept the photo albums. I found the one from 1992, when David and I first bought the Riverbend house. On the last page was a picture of us standing by the porch, Evan sitting on David's shoulders. The caption David had written in blue ink, "Our home, forever." I closed the album and placed it beside the deed. Forever had turned out to be shorter than I thought, but I wasn't broken. I was awake. I poured another cup of tea and stared out at the fading sky. The first evening star blinked above the trees. I thought of David again, of his quiet voice and steady hands. I thought of how he once told me, "When the world shakes, don't shout. Build steadiness from the inside." That night, I understood what he meant. I didn't know how yet, but I would find a way to make things right, not with anger, but with something sharper. Tomorrow, I would call Margaret Sloane. The next morning, the air smelled faintly of rain again, as if the world wanted to start over. I wore a navy sweater David had given me years ago, the one with sleeves just long enough to hide the trembling in my hands. I drove downtown, the streets quiet except for the distant hum of construction and the low whistle of wind through the bridge cables. Charleston always looked calm from the outside. I wondered if that was why people believed peace was the same as silence. It isn't. Sometimes silence is the sound of planning. Margaret Sloane's office was on the third floor of an old brick building near the courthouse. The plaque beside the door still bore her maiden name, Sloane and Associates. She had been David's colleague before she started her own practice, and though we hadn't spoken much since the funeral, I knew that if anyone could help me without judgment, it would be her. When I walked in, she was exactly as I remembered. Silver hair tied back neatly, reading glasses perched halfway down her nose, that unshakable air of quiet intelligence. She looked up from a stack of papers and smiled. "Helen Avery," she said, rising to greet me. "It's been too long." "Too long," I agreed, though I wasn't sure how to fit the years between us into small talk. She poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "You're here about the house, I assume?" I nodded, my voice steadier than I expected. "It was sold without my consent, by my son." Margaret's expression didn't change much, but her eyes softened. "Tell me everything from the beginning." So I did. The call, the open house, the missing box. Every word came out carefully, as if speaking too quickly might break them. When I finished, she sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the soft ticking of a clock behind her. "Do you have the deed?" she asked finally. I slid the envelope across the desk. "Right here. My signature, no one else's." She examined it closely, running her thumb over the edges before nodding. "Good. That helps." Then she opened another folder and pulled out a blank document. "What you're describing sounds like a forged power of attorney. If your son submitted one to authorize the sale, it would be illegal. We'll need proof." "I don't want to ruin him," I said quietly. "I just want what's right." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Justice isn't about ruin. It's about truth. And truth doesn't shout. It gathers." I let those words settle between us. There was something calming about her certainty, the way she spoke like someone who'd already walked through storms and learned not to fear the thunder. "Here's what I suggest," she continued. "We don't confront him yet. Not until we know the full picture. I'll bring in someone to help. An investigator named Carl Mendoza. He's thorough, discreet, and he owes me a favor." "What will he do?" "He'll trace the paperwork, check the signatures, talk to the realtor if necessary, quietly." I nodded, though the idea of someone prying into my son's affairs made my stomach twist. "And what about the sale?" "It isn't finalized until the funds clear," she said, tapping her pen thoughtfully. "That gives us time. If we can prove misrepresentation before the transfer completes, we can freeze it, but we'll need to act fast." She looked up at me then, her eyes steady. "I'll draft a trust for the property, something in your name alone, separate from any claim your son might have filed. We'll record it privately before any freeze request. If this goes well, by the time he realizes what's happened, the house will already be protected. I stared at her. You can do that? She smiled faintly. Helen, I've spent 30 years protecting people who didn't know they were in danger until it was almost too late. You're not my first. Her confidence made me feel lighter, though the weight of everything still sat behind my ribs. What will you call it? I asked. The Avery Family Trust, she said. It has a nice ring to it. I laughed softly, the sound surprising me. David would have liked that. She looked at me for a long moment. You know, he once told me something I never forgot. Helen has the kind of patience that can build a bridge from silence. I think he'd be proud of you right now. The compliment made my eyes sting. I took a sip of coffee to hide it. Thank you, Margaret. She handed me a small card. Here's what I need from you. Don't confront Evan or Tara. Not yet. Keep every message, every receipt, every call. Let them think you're unaware. The more they act freely, the clearer their intentions become. Let silence be your evidence. I nodded again, this time with resolve. Margaret picked up the phone and dialed a number. Carl, she said when the line clicked. I've got a situation I need your eyes on. Forged authorization, family property, possible fraud. Yes. Quietly, please. She paused, then smiled. You'll like her. She's sharp. She hung up and turned back to me. He'll reach out tonight. In the meantime, start keeping notes. Every detail matters. Sometimes justice hides in the small things. When I left her office, the sky had shifted to a pale gray, clouds rolling in from the coast. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the wind brush against my face. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel powerless. I felt deliberate. As I drove home, I glanced at the rearview mirror. My reflection looked older than I remembered, but steadier too. The kind of steady that only comes when you decide to stop waiting for someone else to make things right. That evening, I placed Margaret's card beside David's box on the mantel. I whispered his name and thought about how proud he would have been. Not because I was fighting, but because I was doing it quietly, with purpose. Before bed, I made one last note in my small notebook. Tomorrow, act normal. Let them think I'm still in the dark. The line beneath it, written smaller, silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. As I turned out the lights, I glanced toward the window. The city was still, the river calm, the stars hidden behind gray clouds. Somewhere in that quiet, I felt the first stirrings of control return. Tomorrow, I would begin my own kind of conversation, one that didn't need words. The morning came wrapped in pale light, the kind that makes everything look calm even when nothing is. I woke early, before the sun had settled fully over the water, and made tea the way David used to, slowly, deliberately, as if the act itself was a kind of prayer. I watched the steam rise, curling into the air like thoughts I couldn't say aloud. The world outside was quiet, but inside my chest, a plan had begun to take shape. Margaret called just after 7. Her voice, even through the static, carried that same steady tone that had always made people trust her. Helen, she said, I spoke to Carl last night. He's already started tracing the paperwork. There's something odd about the notary stamp on your supposed authorization. We'll know more soon. Thank you, I said. Remember, she added, don't change your behavior. The less they suspect, the more they reveal. After we hung up, I looked around the apartment. Every detail of my life felt smaller now, contained. I needed to move carefully, like a bird pretending to limp so its wings wouldn't be noticed. I took my purse, tucked the envelope with the deed inside, and drove to Riverbend Drive. When I pulled up, Evan's car was already there. He was outside, crouched near the front steps, painting the railing a glossy black. Tara stood by the door, scrolling on her phone. From where I sat, they looked like any ordinary couple, busy, tired, trying to make things work. If I hadn't known what I knew, I might have felt proud watching them care for the house. I stepped out of the car, closing the door softly. Evan turned, surprise flickering across his face. "Mom, you should have called first." "I was in the neighborhood," I said. "Brought you some muffins." I held up a small tin I'd filled that morning, pretending the gesture was casual. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's sweet of you." "Tara, Mom brought muffins." Tara looked up, her expression polite but tight. "That's nice, Helen. Thank you." I handed her the tin, watching how she avoided my gaze. Her nails tapped lightly against the metal lid. A nervous rhythm. I used to recognize that kind of rhythm in my patients. It was what people did when they were trying not to tell the truth. "I saw the house looks beautiful," I said, letting my eyes drift toward the fresh paint. "You've both done so much." "Yeah," Evan said, rubbing the back of his neck. "We've been busy. A lot going on. Just trying to get things settled, you know." "Settled?" I repeated softly. "That's good." He didn't notice the way my voice caught on the word. Tara excused herself to answer a call inside. Evan kept talking about repairs, new furniture, the future. His words tumbled over each other, full of details but empty of meaning. I nodded, smiled, said little. Every lie reveals itself if you give it enough silence to echo. After a few minutes, I said, "I still have the deed, you know, the one David and I signed all those years ago." Evan froze for half a second, then forced a laugh. "Oh, that? Yeah. I think we made a copy for the mortgage stuff. Tara handled most of it." I smiled gently. Of course she did. He looked relieved when I didn't press further. When I left, he hugged me quickly, his arms stiff, his breath shallow. It wasn't the hug of a son. It was the hug of a man hiding something. I drove straight to Margaret's office. Carl was waiting in the hallway, a tall man in a gray coat with kind eyes that missed nothing. He nodded in greeting. "Mrs. Avery, I've been looking into your son's transactions. He moved a large sum of money through an account connected to a realty escrow. The dates line up with the supposed sale." "Can you prove it's forged?" I asked. "Not yet," he said. "But we're close. There's a scanned signature, your signature, from a document sent to Palmetto Realty. It was uploaded from a home IP address registered to Tara Avery." I felt the air leave my lungs slowly. "So she was part of it." Carl's tone softened. "Maybe not out of malice. Pressure does strange things to people. But the evidence will speak for itself." Margaret joined us, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. "Carl will keep tracing the trail. In the meantime, Helen, I've filed the Avery Family Trust. It's official as of this morning. You're now the sole trustee. That means any sale attempt without your explicit approval can be contested and frozen under fraud suspicion." I let her words sink in. "So the house is safe?" "Not entirely yet," she said. "But soon. What we need now is timing. Let them think the sale went through. We'll allow the process to reach the final wire transfer. When it does, I'll act. That's when they'll discover who really owns it." Her eyes held mine. "Can you keep playing along until then?" I thought of Evan's nervous smile, Tara's restless hands, and the box of David's ashes still missing from the house. "I can," I said. "I owe that much to the truth." That evening, back home, I sat by the window and opened my notebook again. I wrote, Act calm. Let them talk. Every silence is a net. A few hours later, a message from Evan appeared on my phone. Love you, Mom. Sorry I've been distant. Just a lot going on. I typed a reply. I understand, dear. I'm proud of you. Then I pressed send, my fingers steady. Across the river, I imagined him reading it, thinking the storm was still far away. But storms never announce themselves. They build quietly in the places no one looks. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the horizon. I closed my notebook, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Let it rain." Because rain doesn't destroy what's strong. It reveals what never was. The invitation came on a Thursday, folded neatly in a cream envelope that smelled faintly of vanilla lotion, the kind Tara always used. Inside was a short note written in her careful, looping handwriting. Dinner tomorrow. Just us. Evan says he misses you. For a moment, I stared at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something honest. They didn't. Still, I told myself to go. Margaret had said to play along, to let them believe I was unaware. But deep down, I also knew I needed to see my son, to look into his eyes and find the boy I once raised inside the man I barely recognized. The next evening, I parked outside the Riverbend house just as the sun was setting. The sky was a wash of pink and gray, the kind of beauty that made you ache a little because you knew it wouldn't last. I stood by the car for a moment, breathing in the faint scent of jasmine from the garden. It was one of the few things they hadn't changed. I carried a small basket of rolls I'd baked that afternoon and walked toward the front door. Tara opened it before I could knock. Her smile was polite, her eyes too bright. "Helen," she said, "you look wonderful. Come in, please." Inside, the table was already set, candles lit, plates gleaming, a soft hum of music coming from a small speaker on the counter. Everything looked picture perfect, almost too perfect, like a scene arranged for an audience that hadn't yet arrived. Evan came in from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "Mom," he said, his voice cheerful but strained. "Glad you could make it." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, though my chest tightened as I said it. We sat down together, and for the first few minutes, it almost felt normal. Evan asked about my garden, about whether I was still volunteering at the clinic. I answered politely, watching his eyes dart toward Tara every few seconds. She kept smiling, but her fork barely touched her plate. Halfway through dinner, Tara reached into a small folder on the sideboard. "Oh, Helen," she said lightly. "I almost forgot. Evan mentioned there's some paperwork we need your signature on. Something about taxes. It's just a formality for the insurance company. Would you mind?" The air seemed to still. I watched her place a single sheet of paper beside my plate, along with a pen. The paper looked harmless enough. Simple header, small print, lines waiting for signatures. But I had spent a lifetime reading between the lines of people's intentions. I didn't touch it. Evan smiled, his voice too casual. "Yeah, Mom, it's just a minor update. You know how complicated this stuff gets. Margaret could probably explain it better than me." I lifted my gaze slowly to meet his. "Margaret?" He hesitated, realizing his slip. "I mean, a lawyer generally. They make everything sound worse than it is." Tara reached for her wine glass too quickly, nearly spilling it. "It's nothing big, really. Just routine." I leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch. "Routine things usually don't need candlelight," I said quietly. Evan exhaled, forcing a laugh. "Come on, Mom. Don't make this awkward. We just wanted to have a nice dinner." For a moment, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that maybe this was all a misunderstanding, that the forged signature and the house listing were mistakes, not betrayals. I looked at my son's face, his tired eyes, the small crease in his forehead that had once made him look thoughtful but now made him look worried. He looked like a man standing on a cliff he couldn't step back from. Then my phone buzzed in my purse. Tara's eyes flickered toward it. Something about her reaction felt off. I reached for the phone and glanced at the screen. A message preview flashed from an unknown number. Carl Mendoza. We have confirmation. Do not sign anything. I looked back at them slowly, my expression unchanged. I'll take it home to read properly, I said, folding the paper neatly. I like to understand what I'm signing. Tara's lips tightened, but she nodded. Of course. Whatever makes you comfortable. Evan looked down at his plate, pushing the food around with his fork. Sure, Mom. That's fine. The rest of the dinner passed in quiet small talk, the kind of conversation where every sentence feels rehearsed, where laughter falls flat because everyone knows what isn't being said. When the meal ended, Tara brought out a small slice of pie. Your favorite, she said softly. Apple with cinnamon. I thanked her, though I barely tasted it. My mind was elsewhere, cataloging every glance, every hesitation. Before leaving, I excused myself to use the restroom. On the hallway table near the stairs, Tara's phone vibrated with a message. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. The text glowed bright against the dark screen. Payment due tomorrow. No delays. I took a slow breath and walked back to the dining room. Tara was pouring coffee. Lovely dinner, I said gently. You've both done a wonderful job with the house. Evan smiled faintly. Thanks, Mom. I'll drop that paper by the lawyer's office in the morning, I added, watching the color drain slightly from his face. Sure, he said. Whatever you think is best. Outside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of rain about to fall. I walked to my car, the envelope tucked in my bag, my pulse calm and measured. Before starting the engine, I opened my phone and began to record a short memo, my voice steady. Friday evening, dinner at Riverbend. They attempted to get another signature under the pretense of taxes. Confirmed financial pressure through message on Tara's phone. Both appear nervous. I saved the recording and slipped the phone back into my purse. The sky cracked open with a soft rumble of thunder, just far enough away to sound like warning instead of threat. As I drove home, I realized I no longer felt the confusion that had clouded me for days. There was no more guessing, only truth, steady and cold. By the time I reached my apartment, rain had begun to fall, slow, deliberate drops that struck the window like punctuation marks to an ending I hadn't yet written. I stood there, watching them slide down the glass, and whispered to the dark, You can't hide the truth forever. Because lies, no matter how neatly set, always unravel under the weight of silence. By Saturday morning, the rain had passed, leaving the streets glazed with light. The air smelled clean again, like the world had been rinsed of something unspoken. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me, the paper from last night still folded neatly in front of me. I hadn't opened it. I didn't need to. I already knew what it was meant to do. Erase me quietly. But I had learned something in 65 years. People who try to erase you always leave a fingerprint behind. At 9 sharp, the phone rang. Margaret's number. I answered before the second ring. We have movement, she said without preamble. Carl found a digital trail tied to the forged documents. The scan of your signature was uploaded from the Avery home network 2 months ago, Tara's laptop. I felt a slow, measured breath leave my body. So it's true. Yes, but it gets worse. The realtor, Carter, was paid a private commission directly from a separate account. That's not standard. It suggests a side deal. He's getting nervous now that we're asking questions. Will he talk? He's already starting to, she said, her tone deliberate. Carl called him this morning. The man's afraid of losing his license. We'll use that fear. I imagined Carter pacing in his sleek office, sweat under his collar, wondering which lie would catch up with him first. I didn't take pleasure in it. Justice, when it's real, isn't about satisfaction. It's about restoration. Margaret continued. We'll need one more thing before I act. Proof of intent. Anything that shows they knew they were deceiving you. Emails, messages, recordings. Carl's on it now. I have something from the dinner, I said quietly. A memo I recorded afterward. It might help establish context. Good, she said. Keep documenting everything. Every word, every detail. It matters. When we hung up, I felt the first tremor of victory. Small, restrained, but steady. It wasn't triumph. It was the relief of seeing a path through fog. At noon, Carl called. His voice was lower, more cautious. Mrs. Avery, I might have found what we need. There's an internal message thread between your son and Carter. The agent tried to warn him that the authorization looks suspicious. Evan replied, and I quote, "It's handled. My mother won't find out." I closed my eyes. My heartbeat didn't rise, but the sound of it filled the quiet room. How did you get that? I used an archived copy of Carter's email database. He's cooperating now, though he's frightened. He said Tara pressured him to process the paperwork quickly because the buyer was ready to pay in cash. Buyer? I asked. A shell company, Carl said. Registered to an address that doesn't exist. It's probably a front for debt repayment. I'll trace it. A pause stretched between us before he added softly, I know this isn't easy, but you're doing the right thing, Mrs. Avery. Doing the right thing, I repeated. Funny how right and hard are so often the same. By afternoon, Margaret called again. Her tone had shifted, calm but sharpened with precision. We've gathered enough for a preliminary freeze, but I need one last assurance. Carter is meeting Evan this evening to discuss final payment. If we can intercept that meeting, we might capture their intent on record. Would you be comfortable if I attended in your stead? I hesitated. The thought of her facing them felt both merciful and cruel. He'll recognize you. That's the idea, she said. Sometimes fear of the truth makes people speak faster than guilt ever could. I smiled faintly. You always had a way with words. That evening, the sky turned the color of bruised steel. I sat by the window, waiting, listening to the city breathe. Every so often, the wind rattled the glass, as if reminding me that peace doesn't mean stillness, it means steadiness in motion. At 7, my phone vibrated. A message from Margaret. He took the bait. Carter just confessed to forging your signature under Tara's instruction. She said it was temporary, to buy time before they could repay a private loan. He's turning over the records. I read the message twice before answering. Is Evan involved directly? Her reply came quickly. Yes. There's evidence he knew the signature was fake, but proceeded anyway. It's all recorded now. I set the phone down, pressing both hands flat on the table. The wood was cool beneath my skin, grounding me. Somewhere in the quiet, I heard David's voice again, that soft echo from years ago. If he ever forgets who you are, remind him who raised him. It wasn't anger that rose inside me. It was sorrow, deep and clean, the kind that doesn't burn anymore. It clarifies. At 8, Carl called one last time. We have the full file. Bank statements, emails, notary confirmation. It's all here. Margaret will assemble everything tonight and move to freeze the transfer by morning. But there was a close call. Carter almost called your son to warn him before he signed the cooperation document. What stopped him? Margaret, Carl said with a small chuckle. She told him that aiding fraud against a family member over 65 was a felony under elder exploitation laws. He signed before she finished her sentence. I laughed softly, shaking my head. That sounds like her. Yes, he said. You've got good people on your side. After the call, I turned off every light in the apartment and sat in the dark for a while. The silence felt different now. Not heavy, not lonely, but full. It was the kind of silence that comes before truth steps into the room. I thought about Evan and Tara, somewhere across town, perhaps believing their plan had gone unnoticed. I wondered if Tara was pacing the same way she had that afternoon I watched her through the window, phone clutched to her ear. Maybe she was crying. Maybe she wasn't. Either way, the path they'd chosen was no longer theirs alone. At midnight, I wrote one last note in my journal. The paper trail is no longer theirs to control. It belongs to the truth now. I closed the notebook and placed it next to David's box on the windowsill. Outside, a single light flickered in the distance, reflecting off the water like a promise finally kept. Tomorrow, Margaret would make the call that would change everything. Morning light spilled through the blinds like liquid gold. It should have been a peaceful day, but there was a stillness in the air that felt electric, charged, as if the world itself was waiting for something to happen. I stood in my kitchen, arranging a bouquet of lilies and roses, white and soft pink, David's favorites. My hands moved with care, trimming each stem, placing them one by one into a crystal vase. From a distance, it would look like nothing more than a kind gesture. Only Margaret and I knew it was something else entirely. Hidden in the folds of ribbon, tucked beneath the blooms, was a small camera no bigger than my thumbnail. Margaret's idea, of course. People act their truest when they think no one's watching, she had said. And tonight, they'll be celebrating their success. Let them talk. I carried the finished bouquet to my car and set it gently on the passenger seat. The air outside was heavy and warm, the kind of southern humidity that clung to your skin. I drove slowly, every mile measured. On the seat beside me, the flowers swayed with each turn, their petals brushing softly against the glass. It felt almost cruel, sending beauty into a place where deception lived. But beauty has a way of catching people off guard. When I reached the Riverbend house, I parked half a block away. From there, I could see the front yard already lit up, string lights along the porch, shadows moving behind the curtains, laughter drifting into the night. They were celebrating. The sale must have been declared complete, at least in their minds. I took the bouquet, walked up the path, and left it by the front door with a small card that simply read, "Congratulations, love, Mom." Then I turned and walked back to my car. I didn't stay to knock. I didn't need to. From my apartment later that evening, I watched the live feed Margaret had linked to my tablet. The picture was clear despite the dim lighting. Just the edge of the dining table, the glint of wine glasses, the shimmer of Tara's dress as she moved across the room. Evan sat at the head of the table, talking too loudly, his gestures broad and careless. Several people were there, 2 couples, laughing, drinking, oblivious. For a while, it looked like nothing more than a gathering of friends. Then, about halfway through the video, Carter appeared at the edge of the frame. His suit looked too tight, his smile forced. He handed Evan a folder. Evan opened it, scanned the papers quickly, and grinned. "Done?" one of the guests asked. Evan raised his glass. "Done. The buyer wired the funds this afternoon. We're officially free." The table erupted in cheers. Tara smiled but didn't lift her glass. Her hand rested on her stomach, and for a moment, she looked far away. Carter leaned closer to Evan. "You sure everything's clean? You said your mom signed, but Margaret Sloan called me earlier. She asked questions." Evan waved a hand dismissively. "She's just being nosy. The signature's fine. Mom won't know until it's over." Tara's voice broke the laughter. "Maybe she already knows," she said quietly. The room fell silent for a beat. Evan looked at her sharply. "What?" She stared at her plate. "Nothing. I just mean, she's not stupid, Evan." He set his glass down hard. "Don't start this tonight." Carter coughed awkwardly, then excused himself, mumbling about taking a call. The camera caught his hand trembling slightly as he passed the bouquet on the table, brushing against the hidden lens. Margaret's voice echoed in my memory from earlier that day. If he admits knowledge of the forgery, even in private conversation, that's intent. That's all we need. The party resumed, but the mood had shifted. The laughter sounded thinner, forced. Tara stood up a few minutes later, leaving the table. The camera followed her briefly as she moved toward the window, her reflection visible against the glass. She pressed her forehead against it, whispering something I could barely hear. I turned the volume up. "I didn't want this," she said softly. "I just wanted to stop the calls." Evan looked over, frowning. "What are you talking about?" Her voice shook. "The creditors. The loans. You said it would fix everything." "It will," he said firmly. "It's done." But his face told another story, one of relief tinged with fear. When the guests finally began to leave, the sound of doors closing and cars starting filled the background. The camera tilted slightly as someone moved the vase aside. For a moment, the lens caught Evan standing alone in the living room. He looked around, his shoulders slumping. Then he whispered to himself, almost inaudibly, "She'll never forgive me for this." I didn't realize I was crying until the screen blurred, not because of the words, but because of the voice, the same tone he used when he was a boy and broke something precious by accident, the kind that came before the apology. The next morning, Margaret came by with a flash drive in hand. "We have everything," she said, setting it on the table. "Verbal admission, financial motive, confirmation of forgery, and coercion. It's more than enough." I looked at the drive. "Does it feel strange?" I asked quietly. "To hear them like that?" She nodded slowly. "It always does. But remember, we're not punishing them. We're protecting you and the truth." I turned the small drive over in my hand, its surface reflecting the morning light. "It's funny," I said, "how they never realized the house was watching them the whole time." Margaret smiled faintly. "It's poetic, isn't it? Justice with a touch of irony." I placed the drive next to David's box. I think he'd approve. That evening, I brewed tea and sat by the window again. Outside, the sky glowed a soft orange fading to blue. Somewhere across town, Evan and Tara were probably sleeping soundly, believing their secret was safe. They didn't know yet that truth had already moved quietly beneath them, like roots beneath soil, patient, unstoppable. I whispered into the stillness, "Tomorrow, you'll see who really owns what. Because justice, when it's real, doesn't roar. It blooms, quietly, beautifully, and right where it's been planted all along. Dawn came softly that day, like the world was holding its breath. The city was still half asleep, the streets glistening from a light mist that had passed through overnight. I stood at the window of my apartment, a mug of tea warming my hands, and watched the horizon turn from gray to pale gold. Somewhere out there, my son believed he had won. He thought the house was sold, the debt erased, the danger over. He didn't know that before the sun fully rose, the truth would find him. Margaret had called late the night before. Her voice was calm, precise, steady, always steady. "Tomorrow morning, the funds transfer clears," she said. "We'll act at 8 sharp. Bank freeze, fraud notification, an official notice of ownership under the Avery Family Trust. By the time Evan gets the call, the sale will be invalid. He won't understand it at first. That's when I'll invite him in." Now, as the clock ticked past 7:30, I watched the light slip across my kitchen table, over David's wooden box and the little flash drive beside it. Evidence and ashes, 2 things that had outlasted lies. I whispered softly, "You'd be proud of how quiet this is, David. Just the way you lived. Just the way I'll end it." At 8:15, my phone buzzed once. A message from Margaret. "He's on his way." I imagined her office then, the blinds half open, the air still cool from the morning, her papers lined up perfectly. Evan would walk in, smiling, confident, maybe even a little smug. He always dressed well when he needed something. I pictured him smoothing his jacket, rehearsing a casual tone in his head. He would expect praise for his success, a nod of approval he never earned but always wanted. What he'd find instead was the sound of truth spoken without anger. I sat down at the table and waited, my tea growing cold. Waiting has never frightened me. I spent years waiting for patience to wake, for David to come home from deployments, for life to calm itself again. Waiting is a form of strength if you know what you're waiting for. At exactly 8:45, my phone rang again. I answered. But I didn't speak. Margaret's voice filled the line, low and even. "He's here." Through the faint hum of the connection, I could hear the creak of a door, footsteps, the scrape of a chair, then silence. "Mr. Avery," Margaret said, her tone professional, crisp. "Thank you for coming in." Evan's voice followed, cheerful but guarded. "Of course. You said it was urgent. I assume it's about the sale. I know the wire was delayed, but I can explain." "There's no need," she interrupted gently. "The wire has been frozen." A pause. "Frozen? What are you talking about?" "The property sale you authorized was processed using a forged power of attorney," she said calmly. "And the property itself is no longer under your control. It was legally transferred into the Avery Family Trust last week." I heard him laugh, the kind of nervous laugh that comes from disbelief. "That's impossible. My mother—" "Your mother," Margaret said, her voice cutting cleanly through his protest, "is the sole trustee, which means she is the only person who has the authority to sell or sign anything concerning that house. The documents you provided were fraudulent. We have digital proof of the forgery, financial records linking your payments to the realtor, and a recording of your own statements confirming intent." The silence on the line stretched. Then I heard him say, quieter now, "She set this up." "She protected herself," Margaret corrected. "And the memory of her husband. This was never about revenge, Mr. Avery. It was about restoring what you tried to take." Another sound, the creak of his chair, maybe him standing. Does she know? She does, Margaret said simply. She knows everything. I could hear the breath leave him, sharp and uneven. Then she said it, the line that would later echo in my mind every time I replayed this day. Mr. Avery, you've just sold a house you don't own. On my end, I closed my eyes. I could almost see it. The moment his face turned pale, the world tilting beneath him as realization set in. Every deceit, every signature, every word he'd used to convince himself it was justified, all of it crumbling in one sentence. He said nothing for a long time. Then, finally, his voice broke the silence. What happens now? That depends on your cooperation, Margaret replied. You'll receive a notice from the bank regarding the investigation. If you wish to avoid prosecution, you'll need to return all funds and make a statement of full admission. The buyer's money is being held pending verification. You and your wife should consult counsel, and, Evan, I would advise you to call your mother. I didn't move. The call ended with the sound of a door closing and Margaret's quiet sigh. I stayed at the table for a while, the phone still warm in my hand. Outside, the world had brightened completely. Birds sang from the trees, oblivious to the wreckage that had just begun. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like truth finally catching up to where love had gone wrong. An hour later, my phone rang again. Evan's number. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, then answered. Mom, he said, his voice small, stripped of its bravado. Margaret told me. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything yet, I said softly. You just have to think about what you've done. He didn't respond. I heard him breathe, slow and uneven, like someone waking from a long dream. Finally, he whispered, I never meant to hurt you. I know, I said, but you did. I hung up before the silence turned into apology. Sometimes the most merciful thing you can give someone is the space to face themselves. That evening, I walked down to the waterfront. The wind off the water was cool and clean. I closed my eyes and felt the weight lift, not from triumph, but from truth finally standing where deceit used to live. Tomorrow, I would see him face to face, in the house that no longer belonged to lies. The Riverbend house was almost unrecognizable when I arrived the next morning. The for sale sign had been taken down, but its shadow still lingered on the grass, a rectangle of flattened green where the metal frame had pressed into the soil. The driveway was empty except for Evan's car. The sky hung low and gray, the kind of sky that made sound travel softly, as if even the air was holding its breath. I stood for a moment before going in. The key still fit, though it hesitated slightly in the lock, as if the house itself wasn't sure whether to let me in. When the door opened, I stepped into a silence so deep it almost hummed. The walls were bare, the furniture gone. Only faint outlines remained where pictures once hung, where life had once filled every corner. Evan was standing in the middle of the living room, his back to me. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his head bowed. When he turned, I saw how much older he looked. His face was pale, eyes ringed in sleepless shadows. For a brief second, he looked like the little boy who used to run to the door when I came home from the hospital after a long shift. But that memory vanished as quickly as it came. Mom, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You came. I did. I walked toward him slowly. My footsteps sounded too loud against the empty floor. Margaret told me you wanted to talk. He nodded, swallowing hard. I don't even know where to start. Start with the truth, I said gently. It's lighter than you think. He looked down at his shoes. I made a mess of everything. I thought I could fix it before you found out. Tara kept saying we could handle it, that it was temporary. The loans, the calls, they just kept coming. I didn't know what else to do. So you sold the one thing that wasn't yours to sell, I said. My tone was calm, not accusing. Calm hurts more than anger ever could. I thought I'd pay it back, he said quickly, desperation cracking through his words. I thought once the sale cleared, I'd fix everything. You wouldn't have even noticed. I let the silence settle between us, long and heavy. You really thought I wouldn't notice losing the home your father built with his own hands? His voice broke. I wasn't thinking straight. I was drowning. I just wanted to make it stop. I looked around the room, the empty shelves, the faint smell of lemon cleaner still lingering. When your father got sick, I said quietly, we almost lost this house once before. The hospital bills piled up. I could have sold it then, but he looked at me from that bed and said, this home is our anchor, Helen. Promise me you'll keep it steady. And I did. Evan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I know. I'm sorry. I wish. Sorry isn't enough this time, I said softly. You didn't just sell wood and bricks. You sold trust. You sold every memory that lived inside these walls. And the worst part is, you did it thinking I'd forgive you like I always do. He shook his head. Please, Mom. I'll make it right. Whatever it takes. I stepped closer, the space between us shrinking until I could see the small scar on his chin from when he was 12. Do you remember what your father used to tell you? I asked. He blinked. About what? If you ever forget who you are, remember who raised you. The words landed like a stone in the quiet room. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, tears slipped down his cheeks. I remember, he said. I remember everything. I nodded slowly. Then you know why I can't protect you from the consequences this time. He started to speak, but I raised my hand. Listen to me. I'm not angry anymore. Anger burned itself out days ago. But you need to understand, trust isn't something I can give back on command. It has to be earned. And that takes time, Evan. It takes truth. He looked at me, broken but listening. What happens now? You'll work with Margaret, I said. You'll return the funds. You'll sign the statements she gives you. You'll do community service. 3 years, she said. After that, we'll talk about forgiveness. He nodded, silent tears still running down his face. I'll do it, he whispered. I'll do whatever it takes. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then I reached out, hesitated, and placed my hand on his shoulder. His body trembled beneath my touch. You're my son, I said quietly. Nothing will change that. But being my son doesn't make you right. It makes you responsible. He leaned forward then, his forehead resting against my shoulder. And for the first time in years, he cried like he did when he was small, helpless, human, undone. I didn't hold him the way a mother comforts. I held him the way the truth holds you when you finally stopped lying, to yourself and everyone else. When he pulled away, his eyes were red, but something in them had cleared. Not peace yet, but the beginning of it. What about Tara? He asked, and I sighed. That depends on her. We all make choices. Some of us learn from them sooner than others. He nodded again, his gaze falling to the floor. Do you hate me? I looked at him carefully. No, Evan. I just wish you'd trusted the love that was already yours instead of trading it for borrowed promises. He said nothing after that. We stood there together in the quiet, two people surrounded by ghosts, of who we were, who we tried to be, and who we still might become. As I turned to leave, I glanced at the mantel. It was empty, but in my mind, I could still see the wooden box that once sat there, the one that read, "Home belongs to you." I touched the spot lightly, as if pressing a seal over something invisible. At the door, I looked back one last time. Evan stood in the center of the empty room, his shoulders bowed, but his head slightly lifted, as though he'd finally remembered what it meant to stand upright. Outside, the light had shifted, the clouds breaking just enough to let the sun through. It fell across the porch in a thin beam, landing where David once planted the roses. I whispered, "It's yours again, love. All of it." Because sometimes, forgiveness doesn't start with words. It starts with truth standing quietly in an empty room. The next day, I woke to the sound of rain against the window. Soft, steady, like someone whispering a secret through glass. It was still early, the world not yet awake. I sat up slowly, the ache in my chest familiar now, though duller around the edges. The hardest part was over, but endings, I've learned, don't come all at once. They arrive in fragments, letters, phone calls, unfinished apologies. That morning, one of those fragments waited on my porch. When I opened the door, a small envelope lay at my feet, the paper damp around the corners, my name written in neat handwriting. I recognized it instantly. Tara's. I carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table, staring at it for a long time before opening it. Part of me didn't want to. Letters are dangerous things. They hold voices you might not be ready to hear. Finally, I slid my finger under the flap. Inside was a folded sheet of lined paper, the ink smudged where tears must have fallen. "Helen," it began, "I don't know where to start. Maybe there isn't a good place to start when you've already gone too far. I owe you the truth, even if it changes nothing." Her words were small and careful, but they cut clean. "I was the one who scanned your signature. Evan didn't want to. He said we could still find another way, but I pushed. I told him we didn't have time. The creditors were calling every day. I was terrified of losing everything, terrified of failing him. I convinced myself it wasn't stealing if we planned to fix it later. I stopped reading for a moment, staring at the rain streaking down the window. The sound matched the rhythm of her sentences. Quiet, relentless, sincere. "I found out I'm pregnant last week," the letter continued. "I was going to tell Evan after the sale went through, after the money cleared. I thought maybe we could start fresh, that we could build something honest from the ruins. But when I saw your flowers, I knew. I knew you already understood everything." That bouquet felt like forgiveness I hadn't earned yet. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the page. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that not everything I did came from greed. Some of it came from fear, and some from love twisted into something smaller and meaner. I see that now. You and David built something strong, and I treated it like a transaction. I'm sorry, Helen, for the house, for the lies, for breaking the quiet peace you built around your life. If our child is born, I hope they have your steadiness, not my ambition. I'm leaving for a while, to stay with my sister until the baby comes. Evan needs space to face himself, and I need space to learn who I am when I'm not hiding behind him." The last lines were almost unreadable. "Thank you for teaching me what dignity looks like, even when the world doesn't deserve it. Please tell David's memory I'm sorry too. I promise I will raise this child to know what honesty costs and why it's worth it. Signed, simply, Tara." I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside David's box. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at both. The rain kept falling. The world washed clean in a way that felt almost merciful. There are apologies that ask for forgiveness, and there are apologies that don't. This was the latter. It wasn't a plea. It was surrender. And I found that I couldn't hate her anymore. Not after reading her truth written in trembling lines. My phone buzzed beside me. A voicemail notification. I pressed play. Her voice came through, soft and uneven. "Helen, it's me. I wanted to say thank you for not destroying us completely. I know you could have. You had every right. I'm sorry for everything. I really am. You don't need to call me back. Just take care of yourself. And please, tell Evan that I hope he finds a way to become the man you raised him to be." Then, after a pause that felt like a breath held too long, she added, "And if it means anything, I'm having a boy." The message ended, leaving me in silence thick enough to feel. I sat there for several minutes, hands clasped around the edge of the table. A boy. The word filled the air like a small light in a dim room. For the first time in weeks, I let the tears come. Not from anger or relief, but from something quieter, something like grace. I whispered to the stillness, "A boy." And then, softer, "Maybe he'll get a second chance before he's old enough to ask for one." I made tea again, the ritual anchoring me the way it always did. As the water boiled, I looked at David's box on the shelf. "You see?" I murmured. "The story's not done yet." Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, the sky lightening at the edges. I watched it fade and thought about what Margaret once told me. Justice isn't always about punishment. It's about the restoration of balance. Maybe this was balance. Maybe not perfect, but enough. I folded Tara's letter once more and slid it into my drawer, right beside the deed, where it belonged. 2 records of ownership, 2 testaments, one of land, the other of conscience. When I looked out the window again, a faint rainbow stretched over the horizon. It seemed almost too deliberate, like the world wanted to underline the moment. For the first time in a long while, I smiled. Because forgiveness doesn't need to be spoken to exist. Sometimes it begins quietly, in the simple act of understanding. Tomorrow, I would return to Riverbend one last time, to gather what truly belonged to me and to say goodbye to everything that no longer did. The road to Riverbend felt different this time, lighter somehow, though the air still carried the scent of rain from the night before. The trees along the drive swayed gently, their branches dripping with water, each leaf glinting like glass in the morning sun. For the first time in months, I wasn't driving there to fight for something. I was going to reclaim what was already mine. The house stood quiet, stripped of pretense. No more balloons, no realtor signs, no laughter that didn't belong. Just stillness. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, breathing in the faint smell of paint and wood. Empty rooms greeted me, hollow but peaceful. The echo of my footsteps followed as I walked from room to room, touching the walls like one might touch a memory to see if it's still warm. In the living room, dust motes floated in the thin beam of sunlight cutting through the blinds. The mantel was bare except for a faint square of lighter wood, where David's box had once sat. I stood there, staring at that space, and then knelt down to look closer. Something inside me had known I would find it, though I didn't know where. I opened the small cabinet beneath the mantel, and there it was, tucked behind a stack of forgotten magazines and a half-empty can of varnish. The wooden box. David's handwriting still etched on the lid, faint but steady. "Home belongs to you." My throat tightened. I ran my fingers over the letters, tracing them like a prayer. The wood was cool against my skin, but the moment felt warm. I lifted it gently and held it close, breathing in the faint smell of cedar and thyme. I whispered, "We kept our promise, love. We kept it steady." Sitting on the floor, I opened the box slowly. Inside was the small velvet pouch I'd chosen for his ashes years ago, and beneath it, a folded piece of paper, one I hadn't seen before. My breath caught as I unfolded it. It was a note written in David's hand. "If you ever stand in this house without me, don't see what's gone. See what's left. You were always the heart of this home, Helen. Wherever you go next, take that with you. The rest is just walls." Tears blurred the words, but I didn't wipe them away. I let them fall, one by one, into the open box. I sat there a long time, the quiet settling around me like a blanket. The house wasn't empty anymore. It was honest again. Later that afternoon, Margaret met me there. She carried a manila folder, her expression soft but firm. "It's done," she said. "The bank has confirmed the freeze, and the title's fully restored to the trust. The sale is voided. The buyer was a shell company tied to a private lender. We've dissolved it." I nodded, still holding the box. "What happens to the funds?" "They'll be redirected to the trust once everything clears. You can decide what to do with them." I looked around at the house, the walls that had seen laughter, betrayal, and silence. "I don't want it anymore," I said quietly. "Not the house, not the money. I want to give it back to something that matters." Margaret tilted her head. "You have something in mind?" I smiled faintly. "Yes, David's scholarship. Remember how he wanted to start one for nursing students who couldn't afford tuition? He always said healing should never depend on money." Margaret's expression softened. "That's beautiful. Fitting, too." "I want to sell the house properly," I continued. "Every cent goes to the fund. We'll call it the David Avery Memorial Scholarship." She nodded slowly. "I'll handle it." We walked through the house together one last time, the sound of our footsteps the only noise. Each room carried an echo of something we couldn't see but could still feel. The laughter that once filled the kitchen, the late-night talks in the living room, the small fights, the reconciliations, the ordinary life that had made the house a home. When we reached the porch, I turned the key in the lock and placed it in Margaret's hand. "Make sure it goes to someone who needs a fresh start," I said. "Someone who knows what a home is worth." She nodded, closing her fingers around the key. "I will." The afternoon light stretched long across the lawn, and I watched it fall through the trees, warm and forgiving. I walked to the car, the box still in my hands. Before starting the engine, I looked back at the house. For a moment, I saw it not as a place of pain, but as a teacher, one that had taught me the hardest lesson of all. You can lose everything and still keep yourself intact. On the drive back, I took the long route along the river. The water shimmered gold under the setting sun. When I reached the small pier where David and I used to sit on summer evenings, I parked the car and carried the box to the edge of the dock. The air smelled of salt and rain. I opened the lid one last time. "You'd like this, wouldn't you?" I said softly. "Turning something broken into something that helps others." The wind lifted slightly, brushing my hair back, and for a moment, I could almost hear him, his steady laugh, the warmth in his voice, the way he always said my name like it was an answer. I closed the box and held it to my heart. "We built something good," I whispered. "And it's still good." When I got home, I placed the box by the window, where the evening light fell directly across it. The house felt different that night. Lighter, freer. I poured a cup of tea, sat down, and wrote a short note to Margaret, confirming the trust's new purpose. My handwriting was steady, deliberate. At the bottom of the page, I added a line David once said to me long ago. Homes can be rebuilt. Dignity must be protected. I sealed the envelope and smiled through the last of my tears. The weight was gone now. What remained was mine. Earned, not given. Tomorrow, I would write one more note, just a few words, and leave it where it belonged. Because some lessons are too important to speak. They must be found. The next morning, sunlight poured through the curtains like a soft blessing. The rain had washed everything clean, and the air outside smelled faintly of jasmine and earth. For the first time in a long while, I woke without that quiet heaviness pressing on my chest. The house was calm, the kind of calm that doesn't come from silence but from peace earned the hard way. I brewed a pot of tea and sat by the window, the same window where I had once watched the storm roll in, wondering if I would ever feel steady again. The wooden box rested beside me, the faint engraving catching the light. I thought about the letter from Tara, about the sound of Evan's voice breaking in that empty room, about the small mercies that had begun to bloom quietly in the wreckage. I didn't know what would happen between us in the years ahead. I only knew that forgiveness, like healing, wasn't a single moment. It was a choice you kept making, one quiet day at a time. But before I could move forward, there was one last thing I needed to do. On the table sat a small stack of stationery. I took the top sheet, smoothed it flat, and picked up my pen. For a moment, I didn't write anything. I just listened. The ticking of the clock, the distant call of a bird, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Life, steady and unremarkable, moving forward. Then the words came, simple and sure. I know. That was all. 2 words. Nothing more. But they carried everything that needed saying. Knowledge, forgiveness, sorrow, love, all tangled together in the silence that followed. I folded the note once, neatly, and slipped it under the corner of the photo frame on the mantel, the one of David holding Evan as a baby, both of them grinning at me from a time when the world was smaller and simpler. I pressed the frame down gently, as if sealing a promise. The doorbell rang just as I was rinsing my teacup. For a moment, I considered not answering. Then I took a breath and opened the door. Evan stood there. His eyes looked clearer than I'd seen in months. He wore no mask of confidence now, no careful charm, just honesty, raw and fragile. In his hands was a folded envelope. I didn't know if I should come, he said quietly. But Margaret said you'd want this. It's the statement she needed for the trust. I signed it. Thank you, I said softly, taking the envelope from him. He hesitated. I didn't come for forgiveness. I know I haven't earned that. I just wanted you to see that I'm trying. I nodded. Trying is where redemption begins. His eyes glistened, but he smiled faintly. I went by the house this morning, he said. It's empty. Feels different now. It's supposed to, I replied. Some places have to empty before they can hold anything good again. He looked past me into the room. His gaze fell on the mantel, where the photograph stood. He took a small step inside, his eyes catching on the folded paper beneath the frame. What's that? He asked softly. I didn't answer. I watched as he reached for it, fingers trembling slightly. He unfolded the note, read the 2 words, and went still. The color drained from his face, not from fear, but from recognition. He looked at me, his voice barely audible. "You know." "I do," I said. "All of it." Tears welled in his eyes, spilling before he could hide them. "I don't know how to make this right." "You can't," I said gently. "But you can live in a way that honors what was almost lost. That's how you start to rebuild." He nodded, unable to speak, his shoulders shaking. For a long time, we stood there. No explanations, no defenses, just the quiet sound of two people learning how to stand in the truth together. When he finally stepped back, I saw something in his expression I hadn't seen in years. Not the boy he used to be, but the man he might still become. "I'll do better," he whispered. "For you, for Dad, for the baby." The baby. The word landed softly between us. I nodded, smiling through the tears I hadn't noticed forming. "Then that will be enough." He placed the note back under the frame, exactly where it had been. Then he touched the corner gently, almost reverently. "I'll see you soon," he said. "Take care of her," I replied. When the door closed behind him, I stood there for a while, my hand resting on the mantel. The house felt different now, warmer somehow, as if it had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Outside, the afternoon light shimmered on the river. The tide was coming in, slow and certain. I made another cup of tea and carried it to the window. For a moment, I let myself cry. Not the sharp tears of loss, but the quiet kind that wash something clean inside you. Behind me, the note stayed where he had left it, simple and still. I know, sometimes, that's all a mother ever needs to say, and all a son ever needs to hear. Tomorrow the papers would be signed, the scholarship would be born, and peace, true peace, would finally have a name. The day of the ceremony arrived clear and bright, the kind of day that carried no trace of storms past. Charleston was alive again, the scent of salt and magnolia in the air, the sound of gulls overhead, the hum of conversation outside the community center where the plaque had just been mounted. The David Avery Memorial Scholarship had become real, carved in bronze and fixed to a wall that would outlast us all. I stood quietly at the back of the small crowd, a paper cup of lemonade in my hands. People had gathered from the hospital where I'd worked, from the nursing school David once supported, and from the neighborhood. I hadn't expected so many faces, so much warmth. Grace Holloway, my neighbor, waved to me from the front row. Margaret stood near the podium, her notes neatly folded, her eyes bright with quiet pride. When the ceremony began, I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Margaret did it for me, her words calm and steady. "This scholarship," she said, "is not just a memorial to a good man. It is a reminder that justice and generosity can grow from the same soil. What was nearly lost has now become something that will help others find their way." Applause rippled softly through the crowd. I saw a young man step forward to accept the first scholarship. His name was Tommy, a veteran studying to become a nurse. He shook Margaret's hand, then turned to me. His grip was firm, his eyes sincere. "Thank you, Mrs. Avery," he said. "You have no idea what this means to me." I smiled. "Oh, I think I do." He nodded, and I saw in his face a reflection of something I thought I'd lost: purpose. Afterward, people mingled and talked, sharing small stories about David, about the house, about life's strange ways of turning endings into beginnings. Grace found me near the refreshments table. "You did something beautiful, Helen," she said, handing me a napkin. "You turned pain into something that feeds people. That's no small thing." I laughed softly. I think David planned it all along. She smiled. Maybe he did. Men like him always find ways to finish what they started. Later that afternoon, I drove to the coast. The ocean had always been where David and I went to think. It wasn't far, just a quiet stretch of sand where the tide met the marshes and the air smelled faintly of salt and hope. I parked near the dunes and walked barefoot across the warm sand, the wind tugging gently at my hair. The waves moved slow and rhythmic, each one folding into the next, unhurried and sure. I stood there, holding David's box, feeling the weight of it one last time. I didn't open it. Not yet. Some things belong to stillness. Behind me, footsteps approached. I turned to see Margaret walking toward me, her shoes in her hand, her smile soft. I thought you might come here, she said. I wanted to say goodbye properly, I replied. You already have, she said gently. But rituals matter. They tell the heart what the mind already knows. We stood side by side, the wind tugging at our clothes. I reached into my bag and took out a sealed envelope. This is for Evan, I said. It outlines the trust conditions. He'll receive access to the family fund only after 3 years of community service, volunteering, giving back. It's not punishment. It's a way to help him learn what value really means. Margaret took it, nodding. He'll understand one day. I think he already does, I said softly. He called last night, said he and Tara are expecting soon. He sounded different, like he finally sees the world as something you build instead of borrow. We watched the sea for a while in silence. A pelican skimmed the surface of the water, wings brushing the waves. I thought of David's words again. See what's left, not what's gone. When Margaret left, I stayed a little longer. The sun dipped lower, scattering gold across the water. I sat down on the sand, feeling the grains cling to my hands, my skirt, my skin. There was something deeply human about it. How the earth insists on touching you, no matter how much you've lost. I placed the box beside me and whispered, We did it, love. It's all steady now. A breeze swept across the shore, lifting my hair, stirring the air. Somewhere beyond sight, I could almost hear his laugh again, the warm, familiar sound that had always steadied me. When I finally stood, I brushed the sand from my palms and turned toward the horizon. The sea stretched endlessly, calm and infinite, carrying every story that had ever ended and begun again. As I walked back to the car, I felt the world return to its rhythm, the tide rolling in, the gulls circling above, the low hum of the wind through the dunes, everything as it should be. At home that evening, I poured one last cup of tea and sat by the window. The sky outside was deep blue, the first stars trembling into view. Grace had left a small bouquet on my doorstep, a mix of lilies and wildflowers tied with a ribbon. I smiled at the gesture. Life has a way of returning beauty when you stop chasing it. I looked toward the mantel. The photograph of David and Evan still stood there, the note resting beneath it. The edges had curled slightly in the summer heat, but the words remained clear. I know. I lifted my cup, took a slow sip, and let the warmth spread through me. Outside, the sea whispered in the distance, steady and eternal. Some houses you lose, some you rebuild inside yourself. And as long as I live, I'll remember what this story taught me, that dignity doesn't shout. It stands quietly, waiting for the right moment to rise. The house was gone. The pain had softened. The silence, once heavy, had become my peace. And in that peace, I found everything I had ever needed.